I think one of your most memorable lines of yours that we're constantly referring back to is "You live on the other side of imperialism," which was a reply to a comradely exchange with Professor David Harvey in light of an American left which buys into the lies of empire, whether related to Cuba, China, or Russia. What role do you think living on our side of imperialism has played in developing these forms of compatible Marxism or compatible leftism, which always seem to oppose the construction of socialism abroad and to parrot State Department talking points about any project struggling against imperialism?
Well, look, I have great respect for David Harvey and for all his contribution to Marxism and so on. But when I did read the book that we were talking about that day, I was actually surprised by his assertion about the end of imperialism. And I think the factor that he was looking at was quite reductive, which is that investment flows had switched direction. You know, that if you're getting investment, say, from India coming to Europe, then, well, there's no more imperialism. Well, then maybe India is imperialist. I thought that was a little reductive. The question of imperialism can't just be restricted to, you know, the direction of investment flows, foreign direct investment. That's not the best metric. Anyway, look, you know, the question of which side you are on is not as relevant as what you're doing. You know, I mean, that to me is the main issue. Right now, the island of Cuba has just been struck by Hurricane Ian. Situation is grim. The electricity grid is in trouble and so on. The US government under Biden not only is maintaining the normal blockade of Cuba, the normal blockade set up in the 1960s, but is actually also maintaining the kind of intensified blockade put in place by Donald Trump. 243 measures of sanctions. They've maintained Cuba on the state sponsor of terrorism list. All of this makes life in Cuba difficult, makes it difficult for Cuba to do normal commerce and trade. These are all illegal sanctions, by the way. They don't have any validity in international law or anything like that. But the US is essentially throttling Cuba. Now, if you live in the United States, I would say a principal place of action is to get the US government to at least remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. This struggle against the throttling of Cuba is a great place for young people to develop an understanding of imperialism. I mean, Cuba is only 11 million people. It exports doctors, for God's sake. It doesn't export terrorists. You want to put a country on the state sponsor of terrorist list? Put Saudi Arabia on that list. After all, those who attacked the US in 9/11, most of them were Saudis. But Saudi Arabia is not on that list. Cuba is on the list. Cuba, which sends doctors all over the world and has given its 5 vaccines for COVID basically free to anybody outside the world. So this is a great example to see what the actual reality of imperialism. There's no other way to understand US policy regarding Cuba than through the framework of imperialism. There's no kind of liberal explanation for this. You've got to have a much harder explanation, which is the Marxist explanation of imperialism. And if that's the case, well, building struggles to defend the rights of the Cuban people to have sovereignty and dignity, I think that's a tremendous way to build a new kind of left energy in the US that will break from the tired debates that had been there for a century, about like whether, a socialist country is actually socialist or is it state capitalist. I mean, those dead boring debates, has China restored capitalism? For God's sake, grow up, guys. We have a world to win. We don't have a world to define. The point isn't to have a more accurate definition based on your premises. The point is to win the world. And you're not going to win the world by having those kind of debates. Right now, if you are a person on the left inside the United States, I think building pressure on the US state to stop the war against Cuba, I think is a key part of your own practice of building, amplifying, strengthening your own political will. One of the limitations of the campaign of Bernie Sanders is it completely ignored foreign policy. And therefore, you then get these kind of post-Bernie politicians like AOC who have no clue when it comes to things happening around the world. You often see them say rather shallow things about places around the world. You got to bring a consideration of the US government's foreign interventions and so on into the emerging socialist current in the United States. Otherwise, it'll become a kind of socialist imperialism. And, the world just can't afford that.
I think that's wonderfully said. I was wondering if you had time for just one short more question. So we recently saw the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of China, where Xi Jinping affirmed that our experience has taught us that at the fundamental level, we owe the success of our party and socialism with Chinese characteristics to the fact that Marxism works. And I think that's a very different spirit from the Marxism that you find in the West. That's, as you mentioned, pessimistic, but also divided, separated from any sort of revolutionary praxis. In the context of a decaying empire, like the one that we have today, which has, it seems like it's continuously failing to in its proxy wars, whether against Russia, against China, in Latin America. What do you think the future looks like for the current geopolitical arena that we're in? Because it seems like the folks leading the U.S. are okay with collective nuclear destruction insofar as it means they can try to continue securing their global imperialist hegemony. So what do you think?
Well, look, I don't want to end with anything quite gloomy, but certainly I agree with Chomsky that the US ruling class is a wretched ruling class that's willing to destroy the earth system to maintain its power. I think that's, you don't need, that's a fact. This is not a statement I'm making, that's not a fact. They deny climate change, for instance, almost totally. They are refusing to enter into arms control talks with the Russians and with the Chinese and so on and so forth. I mean, this is a really destructive ruling class. But because it's so destructive and because it's so empty of ideas, vacuous, mediocre ruling class, mediocre politicians, because of that, it opens a lane for bright young people like yourselves to go out there and articulate better ideas, germinate new kinds of struggles and so on. I mean, now Mr. Biden has said that his government wants to end hunger in the United States. Now, after China has already abolished absolute poverty, now the United States says we are interested in abolishing hunger. How are they going to do it? With more NGO privatized forms of charity? It's not going to work like that. It doesn't work like that. The Chinese have actually proved in practice that you've got to create social transfer payments. You've got to create more public goods. You've got to create, at a minimum, a public healthcare system, an infrastructure that takes care of people. You've got to create a system of generating food production near where people live and where people are able to get food, perhaps in a public system where prices are one way or the other controlled. These are elementary things that the Chinese have actually proved. At Tricontinental, we did a report on the abolition of absolute poverty. It's worth looking at that report because it's not like some ideological statement. We look practically at what they have done. And I would like to send a copy to Mr. Biden. You're interested in eradicating hunger in the United States? Go and study what the Brazilians did under Lula with Fome zero hunger, that policy for which Brazil won a prize from the United Nations. Subsequent to the rise of Temer and then Bolsonaro, hunger rates have gone very high in Brazil. Go and have a look at what the Brazilians have done. Take a lesson from the Chinese. That's what I would say to Mr. Biden. But, they are mediocre leaders. They don't want to look at these things. But you must go among the people. You must share these ideas, you must come with the world into the United States. I think it's been too long that people in the United States believe they have the answers to everything. I think now people in the United States need to acknowledge that they merely live on the planet Earth as part of a community of nations. And as much as we can learn things from the United States can learn things from other countries. And on this, they can certainly learn a thing or two from the Chinese.